You don't need to go around and judge other people based on this quote-unquote moral code, which, as you can see, is tremendously relative between different cultures. People, 50 sexual partners before we started our relationship. Some people would call that immoral. These concepts of good and bad are purely legal fictions. I personally subscribe to the philosophy that thou shalt not judge. I don't judge anybody. First of all, that the 10 Commandments were written by human beings, and they were written and designed to control people. Where do our morals come from, right? Where does the concept of morality come from? That morality is absolutely relative. The concept of morality is purely a legal fiction. So let me know what you think. Do you think that morality is relative, or do you think that morality is absolute? Do you think that our morals have changed or evolved from the past 3,000 years? Do you think that there's still a need for divine scripture to rule our lives? Or do you think we've become kind of smart enough to be able to govern ourselves independent from divine scripture and rely solely on democratically created laws? And welcome back to the Contemporary Happiness channel, the channel where we discuss the art and science of happiness in contemporary culture. In today's video, I want to talk about the concept of judgment, and more specifically, whether or not morality is absolute or relative. So let's get right into it. Now, if you've read my book, Good Problems to Have, The Anatomy of Contemporary Happiness, you know that I discuss about judgment and morality in chapter 8, the title of which is called No Judgment. I personally subscribe to the philosophy that thou shalt not judge. I don't judge anybody. I have my own personal preferences in terms of kind of behavior that I enjoy and behavior that I don't enjoy. And I do my best to be around people whose behavior I like and stay away or keep distance from people whose behavior I do not like. But I do not judge. The only person that should be judging in modern day societies are professional judges. You as an individual have no responsibility to judge others. Judging others just creates divisiveness, in my opinion. So I accept everybody as they are. I don't judge them, but I have my own personal preferences in terms of the types of people that I like to associate myself with, or the types of behavior that I like to be around, okay? So let's get into this a little bit more detail, and of course, pick up a copy of my book, Chapter 8, No Judgment, where I go into the kind of the actual details of how I came about with the philosophy of no judgment. So the question here is whether or not morality is absolute or if it's relative. What I mean by relative is that sometimes, depending on context, for example, certain behavior may not be as immoral as otherwise seen. So let's think about this a little bit more clearly here. And I'm here to tell you that morality is absolutely relative. The concept of morality is purely a legal fiction. And that's why you're wise to get away from morality and solely focus on your own personal preferences of what you like and don't like. Of course, we all live in a society where there's a social contract and there's consequences for all types of behavior. So you're going to have to factor that in to your choices. But nevertheless, there's no divine scripture here on which morality is based. Okay? So the first thing I think we need to kind of think about is where do our morals come from, right? Where does the concept of morality come from, right? Now, some people would argue that it comes from God. Of course, in my opinion, these are not serious people, right? We cannot live our lives based on this unproven story that there's an old man in the sky, right? There's an old man in the sky that came up with the 10 Commandments, for example, that now dictates how we should conduct ourselves, right? To me, that's absolutely a fairy tale. And I think it's much more plausible that the 10 Commandments were written by human beings, and they were written and designed to control people, but in a good way. They were designed to control human behavior and to kind of using a reward system to incentivize certain behavior and disincentivize other behavior. And as I discuss in my book and throughout my podcast, the Ten Commandments and the concept of morality was tremendously beneficial to human society, historically speaking. Before the concept of the Ten Commandments, there was nothing stopping other people from lying, for example, from stealing, for example, from committing violent acts, right? Let's say you're hungry and you see somebody walking down the street with a piece of bread. You might go and hit that person over the head and take their bread because you're hungry. It's a little bit human nature to want to do that. So we came up with the concept of morality. We came up with the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, for example. Thou shalt not steal, for example. So that the person who's hungry has to resist the urge to go and commit violence and get bread, and therefore is going to have to engage in what you would call more civil ways of getting bread, for example, to feed himself, such as working, for example, earning money, for example, doing trade with the bread shop, for example. There's different ways that you can acquire bread and bring it into your house and feed yourself and feed your family. And what the Ten Commandments did is that it disincentivized one of the more kind of primal ways that people went about and got bread, which is to go and steal from somebody else who has bread, or to commit acts of violence, potentially overpowering somebody who might be smaller than you so that you can take their bread and feed your family. So the Ten Commandments had tremendous utility roughly 5,000 years ago when they came into existence, because it helped civilization, it helped human beings live in a more civilized system, right? By using this concept of rewards and punishment, right? You get rewarded for being an honest person, right? Society will hold you in high regard. And of course, scripture tells us that if you are an honest person, then you'll go to quote unquote heaven in the afterlife. On the contrast, if you're a dishonest person, if you're a known liar, if you're a known thief, or you're a known murderer, for example, not only does society look down upon you, they look at you with condemnation, but you also will be punished potentially through the judicial system by going to jail, and you'll be punished, according to scripture, in the afterlife by going to hell. So morality, the concept of the Ten Commandments as we know it, and the backbone of most of our moral code in contemporary society, was really just a reward system that was designed to control people and incentivize people to live in a much more civil manner together, and to resist our primal urges to commit violence, to commit theft, to lie and deceive, for example, all for personal gain. So I think it's important to know where our moral codes came from. A lot of us hold the concept of morality and moral codes very highly in our lives. And I think it's important to kind of analyze where did this moral code come from, and more importantly, why? Why did this moral code 10,000 years ago, or excuse me, 5,000 years ago, why did it come about? And the answer to why is so that it could incentivize people to live in a more civilized community compared to the ancestors prior to that generation that had much more of a savage lifestyle. So I think what's interesting about when you want to consider whether or not morality is absolute or relative, I think it's interesting to look not at the kind of universally accepted moral codes such as thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal, but let's look at some of the more, less common morality, moral scriptures that we see, moral codes that we see in our scriptures. For example, in some societies, it is immoral to eat pork, for example, right? In some societies, it is immoral to masturbate. In some societies, it is immoral to be a homosexual, right? Now, I think if you're watching this video and you live in a liberal society, I think you would agree that in contemporary culture, in modern day culture, doing things like eating pork, masturbating, or engaging in homosexuality is not necessarily immoral to us, right? In some cultures, eating pork is actually also illegal. It's against the local laws to eat pork. Homosexuality in some cultures is illegal, right? Masturbation in certain cultures is right now illegal. Of course, in the United States, all three of these things are perfectly legal. So the question then becomes, which culture is the more moral culture, right? Is it the culture that prohibits eating pork, masturbation, and gay marriage? Or is it the culture that values human rights and does not punish somebody for eating pork, masturbation, or gay marriage, right? Which culture is more moral? And the answer is you can't really answer that question. What's happened is that each culture has adopted their own kind of customs, so to speak, their own rules of law, right? Now, some of these rules of law are inspired by moral codes and scripture, right? Like thou shalt not kill is a law in the United States, but it's also part of the 10 Commandments. So it goes back to scripture and it's based on that moral code. But some of the moral codes did not make their way into United States law, right? Eating pork is not prohibited in the United States. Homosexuality is not prohibited in the United States, right? Masturbation is not against the law in the United States. So as you can see, I mean, it would be hard to argue which society is more quote unquote moral, the society that prohibits masturbation or the society that does not punish people for masturbation. Is it the society that prohibits eating pork or the society that does not punish people for eating pork? Okay, so I don't know. I mean, it's hard to decide, which one is the more moral society. And the way I live my life is if I like conduct that is illegal in the place that I'm living, I will do my best to move somewhere where the conduct that I enjoy is legal. So if I enjoy engaging in homosexuality, and if I'm living in a country where homosexuality is illegal, well, guess what? I'm going to do my best to move to another country where homosexuality is permitted. Same thing with eating pork. If I enjoy eating pork, but if I'm living in a country where eating pork is illegal and I can be punished, I can go to jail for engaging in that behavior, well, I'm going to do my best to move to another country where eating pork is not prohibited. And this also applies to individuals, right? If for example, I really don't like when people jaywalk, right? I like it when people use the crosswalk to cross the street. People who jaywalk, I don't like it personally, right? Now, in most countries, jaywalking is illegal, but it's not up to me to judge somebody and say, oh, you're bad. You're bad for jaywalking, or you're bad for eating pork, or you're bad, or you're good for engaging in homosexuality. These concepts of good and bad are purely legal fictions. What I do to conduct my life is that I try to associate myself with people who have shared values based on my personal preferences. So if I enjoy eating pork, I'm going to spend time with people that like eating pork. If I don't enjoy it, I'm going to create distance with people that don't eat pork, right? Let's say I don't like pork, but my girlfriend likes eating pork. Guess what? We're going to stop dating. And I'm not here to judge her. I'm not here to say, oh, you're bad because you're eating pork, and I'm good, I'm holy for not eating pork. And if you take this principle and you apply to all the other kind of moral judgments that people make against each other, right? Let's say, for example, my girlfriend has had sex with 5 people before our relationship, right? Now, a lot of people consider that to be immoral. Or let's say if she had sex with 50 people, 50 sexual partners before we started our relationship. Some people would call that immoral. Which one is right? As you can see, it's to each their own. Some people think having 5 sexual partners is too much. Some people think that's not too much, but having 50 sexual partners is too much. And some people don't care about 50 sexual partners and would say you can have 200 sexual partners, and that's still fine. I still want to spend time with you. I still like you. I enjoy your company, and I'm going to continue to spend time with you. Other people might say, oh, if you've, have had 5 sexual partners, that's too much for me, so therefore I'm going to have to break up with you. I don't want to spend more time with you because I don't like that lifestyle. Who's right? Who's more moral? Nobody. These are all personal preferences, right? So as you can see, the big obvious ones like thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal, I think we can all universally agree that these are preferred human behaviors. And we have social rules, we have local laws that reward people who don't kill and punish people who do kill based on that reward system, but it's now tied to the judicial system, no longer this kind of divine scripture and moral code. But when you get down to things like number of sexual partners, for which, at least in the United States, there's no law against the number of sexual partners that you can have. Now, it's up to you personally to decide whether or not this is something that's in line with your personal preferences or it's outside of your personal preferences, and you can act accordingly. You can make your decisions accordingly. There's no reason to judge other people and start labeling their behavior as good or bad. Let's look at it just one more example, one more layer of analysis here. I think we can learn a lot from the animal kingdom. Let's talk about cats and dogs, right? Cats and dogs, they don't have, a moral code, and they don't even have local laws, right? The way a cat or a dog decides whether or not they want to spend time with you is based on their personal preferences, right? They may not want to spend time with you, and therefore they'll maintain a distance away from you. Or they may want to spend time with you, and they come closer to you. When I'm walking around with my dog on the street, there's certain animals, for example, that my dog will completely ignore. On the other hand, there's other animals that my dog is tremendously attracted to and wants to go and be close to those animals. This is purely based on personal preferences. My dog is not analyzing whether or not this animal is more holy and moral or good, and this animal is immoral or bad. There's no good or bad. It's all about what my dog personally prefers to do. So the same can be applied to human beings. You don't need to go around and judge other people based on this quote-unquote moral code, which, as you can see, is tremendously relative between different cultures, right? You don't need to judge them. You're well advised to use your own personal preferences to make decisions and leave the judging to the people whose job it is to judge others. And those are professional judges. They're in the business of judging others and determining punishment for people who kind of breach what's called our social contract, right? And as you can see in secular countries like the United States, the local laws are not based on Holy Scripture. The local laws are democratically created laws. And we can change those laws, right? Let's look at, for example, a very hotly contested issue like capital punishment. I personally don't like capital punishment. I don't think it's effective, and I think it's much more reasonable to put someone in jail or put them in prison for life rather than execute them. I don't like the idea of governments executing human beings, okay? In California, which is where I'm at right now, there is no capital punishment on the books. Technically, I think it is still legal in California, but the state has stopped actually carrying out those executions, right? In some other states in the United States, there is no capital punishment, and the maximum penalty that you can get for basically breaking the law is life in prison. In other places in the United States and around the world, there is capital punishment, right? Which state or which territory is more moral? In my opinion, I think it's not preferred to engage in capital punishment. In my opinion, that's my personal opinion. That's my personal preference, right? But I'm not here to determine whether or not there's a state that is more moral versus another state based on the concept of capital punishment. And the point is that at any time, at least in the United States, the citizens of that state can vote to make capital punishment legal or illegal. And the legality of that type of punishment is not tied to morality. It is purely the will of the people that has been enacted into law in a democratic way. And in my opinion, that's the best way to create laws. That's the best way to create this social contract that governs all our behavior. Democratically created laws, not this kind of arbitrary moral code, this divine moral code that supposedly came from God and now must be enforced upon all the people without any compromise, without any consideration of contemporary culture. I mean, these scriptures are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. Do all of those principles necessarily apply to contemporary culture? I don't think so. Morality is relative. It is not absolute. And the only people who should be judging other people and labeling behavior as good or bad are professional judges. You as an individual are well advised to free yourself from the chains of judgment and live by your own personal preferences. Of course, understanding that you live in a society where there is a social contract and there are consequences for your actions. So let me know what you think. Do you think that morality is relative, or do you think that morality is absolute? Do you think that our morals have changed or evolved from the past 3,000 years? Do you think that there's still a need for divine scripture to rule our lives? Or do you think we've become kind of smart enough to be able to govern ourselves independent from divine scripture and rely solely on democratically created laws? I'm your host, David Nima. Thanks for listening to the Contemporary Happiness Podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel on YouTube, and I'll see you all in the next episode.